Okay, it's the 18th of November. This is lecture 12. And talking today about co-research. Let me present the slides. Please, share. You might want to put your name on the list. Okay, so you can see the slide. I wanted to start off by talking again about the different ways in which over the last decades, anthropology has tried to reinvent itself after the devastating and deserved critique of colonial association and the problems that anthropology faced when it was no longer simply able to ride on the back of colonial power into countries and study without permission, basically. One of the things that anthropologists tried to do was to study at home. Anthropology at home became a phrase in the 70s or so, 70s and 80s, became very popular in the 1980s. And I still remember my teacher, Malcolm Crick, talking to me about anthropology at home, how you could do anthropology by just walking out your back door, and you could do anthropology there because of this his concept of the anthropological sensibility. Not his concept, but the concept. That because anthropology was a kind of way of thinking abstract concepts, but always looking for an example or a story from observed life to explain that concept. So if it was reason or if it was science or magic or hatred or love or whatever the concept was, anthropologists were always looking for some little stories that explain these things from their fieldwork. Okay? The weird thing is, I'm using Malcolm Crick as a story. He's talking about anthropology at home and how you could do anthropology just by walking out your backyard, back door, front door. But he used to tell us this, lecturing, standing in front of the students, lecturing with his eyes closed. So he would talk to us with his, like, quite big eyeballs, and you could see, it's as if he was reading the back of his eyelids. He was inside his own head, which is kind of ironic for anthropology. They're supposed to be observing people, right? The trouble is that anthropology at home didn't quite work because, all right, if you accept that the critique of anthropology was a critique of a discipline that assumed it could go out there and study others, villages, tribals, other people, bringing anthropology back home kind of backfired because all they really did was start to study others at home. So the first anthropology at home was about women living in caravans, so-called Romani people, or about young men, working class men in Birmingham. I'm thinking of Paul Willis, Learning to Labour, a great book, but, you know, with issues. Or studies of ethnicity, migrant people or diasporic people, or racism. And this was just repeating the same structure of anthropologists studying the marginal or staring at people who were, not in power. Of course, anthropology at home that would study those in power was very difficult. You can see examples of this. The work of George Marcus, for example, his book Elites, which is in part a study of rich families in Texas, and yet at the same time the book is about the difficulties of studying rich family, because the difference between a marginal or ethnic or a minority people or a tribal or a village group is that the rich can afford to say no. When an anthropologist comes and said, I want to study, the rich people, rich folks have got privacy, and they employ media liaison people or publicists or security guards to manage what anyone can find out about them. Their observed moments are very carefully scripted. I don't know if you watch TV series, or for example, you might have seen the TV series finished recently called Succession, about a wealthy media family, kind of based on the Murdoch family, I think. In America, Murdoch's Australian, but he's also American. And their access to their life and their staging of photo ops and so on is very clear. The opposite of what anthropology wants and needs to do. So anthropology at home didn't work so well because it didn't really change or solve the contradiction of staring at other people, staring at the minority or those without power, and it couldn't find a way to study those with power. It couldn't get access. So it remained a kind of voyeuristic, colonialist enterprise. And that made it hard to argue that anthropology was still relevant to public life. Now, this is the big thing about anthropology. The anthropologists had always felt they had something to say to the public. Malinowski, Evans Pritchard, so on and so forth. Levi-Strauss writing essays for UNESCO on racism. Malinowski dealing with black Bolshevism in Africa and so on. But the idea of anthropologists having a contribution to public intellectual life became problematic after the critique and the disappearance. I mean, on the other side, there was Ruth Benedict and Clifford Geertz and so on working for, effectively, the American state. And we've also studied a little bit the anthropologists who worked for the US military, the Counterinsurgency Manual. But the role of anthropologists as public intellectual has faded, along with the role of most academics, must be said, faded as public debate has become something for pundits and celebrities, basically. I mean, everyday people also have something to say about public life, but the press would tell us that people aren't that interested in debates about issues like racism or politics. Instead, they're interested in where Angelina Jolie went on holiday, which resort and Condau did she go to, or what celebrities do, or even the news is now presented by celebrity comedians. So here's the thing for anthropology. It was negotiating the troubling oppositions or dilemmas a dialectic between its past history and a sense of urgency. Urgent anthropology, right? We're in a world that's in trouble. Indigenous people, its traditional object of observation was, you know, since Levi-Strauss's day, even under some kind of threat. When I first started in an anthropology job in the anthropology department at University of London, Goldsmith, there was a job in that department, not my job, but another job, dedicated, funded by the Royal Anthropological Institute, and it was called the Urgent Anthropology Fellowship. And so each year there would be someone appointed who was doing a project that was urgent. I think the first year I was there, it was Stuart Hirsch, who was working on mining or logging or water rights, something to do with Papua New Guinea, the Haganahs or the Highlanders in Papua New Guinea, who were under threat from the, maybe they were in Papua, Indonesian state, or the mining companies or something. And there was a sense that this was urgent because of the environmental crisis. I mean, this was 30 years ago, 25 years ago. Right? But already then, anthropology was trying to be relevant and trying to use its position to make some contribution to public debate and to include the defense of remote and largely ignored people. I mean, who was paying attention to the Highlanders when we had Angelina Jolie to think about? Well, not then, but the equivalent. So between the past of anthropology, its guilty past, and the need to urgently make a contribution, there was a kind of contradiction that affected the way it tried to be public. Its desire for relevance on the one hand, but then entering into a world the last 30, 40 years especially, where the product of anthropology has also become more and more a commodity. Anthropologists in the business of selling books and selling courses, selling their own university as the place for people to come and study higher education as a commodity. So there's something weird in that, contradictory in that. You write a book about an urgent issue that's affecting some people in Highland New Guinea, and you need to make that public and mainstream it. At the same time, you're selling it for money. Books are for sale, books are commodities. Okay, not many anthropologists make much money from selling books. It's very rare. From actual sales, maybe, you know, $1 per book, £1 per book. You have to sell a lot of books to make any decent money from that. And anthropology books don't sell that much. River of Calcutta, maybe 2,000 or 3,000, right? In 20 years. It's not much. Although the payback actually is that you trade publishing books for getting a job as a professor. And that's the kind of way in which you get paid to produce books. You also are paid to teach, but the primary qualification for teaching is having done an important book. So there's a contradiction between relevance and commodification, and between people and intellectual relevance, right? The relevance of a study of the Highlanders in PNG, or of the Chobrianders or the Noor or something is clear to us, but for the public, they're not really that interested in obscure corners of the world. They want to know what's happening with celebrity politicians like Trump and Obama, or the Canadian Prime Minister when he came to Vietnam, or with celebrities. So there's another contradiction in anthropology's context that it's having to negotiate. And these are reasons why it's difficult to see how anthropologists could become public intellectuals again, because their projects are full of contradiction and their relevance is difficult to establish in today's media environment in the so-called current conjuncture. Actually, yeah, my slide is on the current conjuncture. I'm not going to talk much about what the current conjuncture is because I talk about that in a different class, but it basically means the nexus of different forces that are relevant to explaining where we are right now, which is basically what most sociology, geography, anthropology, most academic work will do. It will take into account the economic, social, political, class, race, gender, all the factors, and try and name that connection in a kind of story that explains something about what's going on. So, who is doing that? Some anthropologists maybe, but it's really, we're in a time of significantly under-examined social change. I mean, the discipline of anthropology is changing radically and it's being talked about, but not, I think the discussion about it doesn't match the significance of the changes. And not just for anthropology, for sociology, but anthropology. For example, this class, we got 52 enrolled in this class. Last year there were 70 enrolled, but this year it's 2 classes of 50, 54 and 52, right? So we've gone up from 70 to 106. So that's a 25% increase. The year before, the class was about 40 people, the year before that 25. So we've been steadily increasing the number of people enrolled, and I think that's across the board. We see that in sociology subjects year on year. Your year is the largest, but I expect the next year will be bigger. I haven't seen them yet. Have I? No, the coming year, but yeah, COVID may be another factor in the current conjuncture that changes things. And it's not just that these changes are happening to disciplines, they're happening to the function of a university. So the things that we would take into account in the current conjuncture are, what is it that the university is here to do? Training more and more people for work in a more and more internationalized, more and more digitized global economy. One where Vietnam sits in an interesting position right now. For example, Vietnam is the chair of the ASEAN network. The meeting is on this week. And as the chair of this network, ASEAN, Vietnam joined 25 years ago, but it's the chair now. At the time when the world's largest trade agreement is now being set up with ASEAN and China and Vietnam and so on. I mean, it's the largest now because Trump pulled America out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? So that's a really significant context where China and Vietnam are probably, well, they're the few countries that have more than 3 or 4% growth in their economy. The rest of capital, global capital, is stagnant. It's not really moving. There's no growth. Despite all the hype and the busyness of, make America great and all of that stuff, there's not really any movement in the economy. There's crises, sure, and that means movement, migration and so on, which also affects Vietnam, of course, to the extent that people can move at all. These are not unrelated to the expansion of the university, right? If Vietnam is involved in this trade agreement at this moment, it's significant because since Doi Moi, Vietnam was trying to do a kind of a gamble to open up to global corporations, Nike or the phone companies or computer manufacturer or other machine manufacturers, and it was attractive to those global corporations because of low wages. So Nike wanted to come and assemble shoes here because it was economically sensible for them to do so because of low wages in Vietnam. But the gamble Vietnam is taking is to give one generation or two generations of these low wages to attract those companies here, and then wages go up inevitably, right? And with those rising wages to then send generations, one or two generations of you all to university, and then hopefully, because the companies have maybe taught or something's been learned from having these global companies in the special economic zones, to turn the special economic zones into R&D parks and innovate new technology, new processes, and pivot the economy from a low-wage manufacture and assembly economy to a high-end innovation, high-performance, high-tech economy with the associated service sector, service area people, a commodity system and various policy and social program support, which is why we need sociologists as well as engineers, to push Vietnam into, a high-performance, high-tech economy, something like what Japan did in the 60s through to the 90s. Not like what Malaysia has tried to do and hasn't really succeeded in doing, or Taiwan or somewhere, but South Korea and China, South Korea and Japan before them had managed to make this move. I don't know how much you know about this, and I didn't want to talk about it a lot, but Japanese technology, Japanese investment movement into the electronics assembly industry in the 60s meant that Japanese products were not very good, right? But they learned the processes, and then in the 80s they were able to innovate new things. Number one, the Sony Walkman, right? Back in the day, when I was growing up, you couldn't carry music in your pocket. You couldn't carry it with you. The only time you listened to music was on the radio or that 10-minute Thursday night music show on TV, or the 1 hour Top of the Pops or countdown on the weekend. Otherwise, if you're lucky, you had a transistor radio that you could carry and cassette tape. The invention of the new tech of the Sony Walkman with tapes and then with Laserdisc was massive, and it elevated Japanese production, and that's only one sector where they were innovating, and the society into a more sustainable, high-performance, high-tech level. Of course, America saw that was happening and then made investment strategy work for it to kind of introduce a stagnation in the Japanese economy that's lasted since the 90s, really. Hasn't been growing that much or at all. China wanted to do the same. China had a population that was large enough to make it internal. It made plastic products for the whole of the world, but it's now pivoting to high tech, and it's outsourcing its production to its own population. Anyway, I'm not getting into that. That's part of the recognition or context in the current conjuncture of labour. What's happening with labour and why universities are training different segments of the workforce. And of course, the two parts of that are a general proletarianization, making workers basically in the same mold, data input operators, and then high-tech workers who will capture some part of the global science base, the general intellect, and be able to innovate. These are the contradictions that are the context of anthropology today. Then the question of autonomy versus disciplinary apparatus. And we've seen that become very relevant in terms of the kind of management of the school, of the university, TDT. Is it to go its own path, or is it somehow essential to the public and national effort of Vietnam? And is it here just to be the best in the world, or is it here to make a contribution? Which is a question that gets put to everyone in universities nowadays. I remember my own Vice-Chancellor in the University of London asking me how my research was good for Britain. And you know, I would be very proud if my research was not good for Britain because of critique. Now, I want to suggest that this is a context in which we're talking about changing anthropology at home and other kinds of anthropology, urgent anthropology. And one that I want to talk to you about, as I said at the start, is co-research or autonomous research. Because this is in the context of thinking about what works, what has worked, and what we should do that's new in the current conjuncture. It seems to me that co-research is perhaps one that holds more promise than others. To that end, our faculty has been talking about having a research group in applied anthropology. Right? That's becoming public intellectual, applying anthropology. You could do applied sociology too, of course, to make an impact. Now, the aim of the research group will be to encourage new kinds of anthropological research in Vietnam, focused on issues of concern to the country, to Asia in general, and the region, and developing a kind of anthropological sensibility, a research skill in ethnography that, well, frankly, the way I've been thinking about it is completely in line with the Prime Minister's adoption of the Global Challenges document of the UN, the Sustainable Goals. In a statement in 2017, the Prime Minister came out with a national action plan that included 17 sustainable development goals that would govern Vietnam's effort at all levels. I mean, this may change with the 13th plenum and all of that, but you know, for the moment, it's still operative, and it included things like the promotion of education and lifelong learning for all. It promoted sustainable, comprehensive, and continuous economic growth, sustainable, resilient urban and rural development, sustainable production and consumption. Now, usually the problem, as anthropologists have pointed out, is there are those who study just production. A kind of stereotype will be orthodox Marxists. They're focused on production. And then there are those that study just consumption, culture studies, popular culture people. Right? And if you focus only on one and not the two together, because production and consumption must be held together, you won't comprehend what's going on. So sustainable production and then some general things like promoting a peaceful, democratic, just, equitable, and civilized society for sustainable development, whatever that is. That was in the National Action Plan announced by Prime Minister Nguyen Xuan Phuc on the 10th of May 2017. Can't make my slide go forward for some reason. Yeah, no? Okay, so what I can do is list some of the things that the research project, the research centre was going to do. And these are standard things like make applications for research, to support research, convene meetings and develop research grant applications and apply to different places for funding so that people can do this work, conferences, workshops, reading groups, PhD program, publishing, maybe consultancy, maybe audits for certain areas of work around culture like tourism or, yeah. But the thing that I want to present and push is something that I've spoken to some of you before, whether you remember or not, I'm not sure, in the Culture in the World course, which is co-research, the inquiry model. And that's why the reading that some of you did, not all, I'm afraid, some of you did on Marx's work as inquiry was so important, right? The inquiry model is one, I think, that really has the potential to enthuse and reinvigorate anthropological production and be adopted and accepted. It goes back to Marx in the 1880s, this workplace inquiry, but it has then a history as well. I mean, Marx was writing raising these questions about the French factory system because the English factory system that he used, that he discusses in Capital, he had a lot of information about that from the government's own factory inspections, the so-called blue books. The blue books which studied the conditions of the working class in England. I mean, that's also the name of Engels' 1844 book, but throughout the 40s, 50s and 60s, led by the chief factory inspector Leonard Horner, there were these blue books produced by the British government talking about the conditions in the factories, especially conditions of young kids and women labouring ridiculous hours, like 16 hours in terrible conditions and so on. And there was nothing similar in France. So Marx had developed this workers' inquiry set of 100 questions, right? Questions like, what's your trade? How many numbers are employed in your factory? What's their age? What's their sex? What's the, state the details as to the division of labour in your factory. Is steam used or gas or electric or what, right? It's not clear that Marx got any responses to this questionnaire. I think very much the questionnaire is in the sense that used it as like a public provocation, an activist document. He got people to consider this questionnaire so that they would raise consciousness about these kind of issues, right? They would be asking questions that didn't usually get asked when you were working in a factory, like, what is the condition of the bathrooms? What's the condition of the toilets? Now, you might have really crappy toilets in your factory, but you don't raise it as a question that much and think about what the toilets are like somewhere else and put that into a kind of survey, unless someone provokes you to ask the question. So it's kind of a consciousness-raising exercise. And this became quite popular. It was also used by the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union, where the newspaper Pravda, which means truth, would send, workers would do reports on their own factories and send them in to Pravda, and Pravda would do articles on the condition in factories. And that you can tell a history of this kind of co-research. It's influenced a little bit by discussions around the early Frankfurt School. Siegfried Kracke talking about the salaried masses, the middle class, earning power of their labour, and how their jobs were somehow deadening in Weimar, in Germany, that is. It has a French tradition, socialism and Barbary, Castoriadis, and it's a little bit anarcho-Trotskyite, but welcome, but of interest. And it has a big, strong trend in Italy, especially around the autonomous movement. And the Italians, Mario Tronti, the head of the Communist Party at the time, or workerism, he would say, he had said very early on, in the 50s actually, that nothing much had been written or studied or researched about the working class since Marx had done that study. It's almost like there's a stereotype of what the working class was. And there was a need to send researchers or to get workers themselves to do the research, to break with the stereotype of the 18th century, like Dickensian worker, to recognize what the worker was today. And that's still the case, to recognize that proletarianization does not mean adopt a cloth cap and a rough cotton jacket and look working class. Class is not a uniform, it's a placement within the mode of production. It's the group of people that are contributing to surplus value, right, that are productive, as opposed to like managers. And this was Autonomia's theoretical position, that workers who produce surplus value are the be-all and end-all of capital. The managers are managing the extraction of that value. But the actual production, the creative part of capital, comes from adding labour to inanimate machines and objects. And we saw that this is true when labour stopped under the lockdown with COVID. All the managers freaked out because there was no one doing the work to keep them in business. So operaismo, Quadrino Rossi, and so on, they follow this tradition of autonomy, which reads back and changes a little bit the old Marxist workers' inquiry type effort. There's a great history of this, the Italian tradition, in Steve Wright's book, Storming Heaven, where he talks about class composition and the struggle in Italian autonomous Marxism, which is, I mean, they innovated a lot of these social inquiry methodologies to have the Fiat car factory workers study their own contribution of surplus value to the production process. Steve Wright offers a pretty impressive, well-researched graph of the influences on the Italian autonomous. And this you can't see it very well, but here we have the influence of Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, Hegelian, the John Forrest tendency, Raya Danievskaya. She was Russian or Polish, I'm not sure, but lived in America, was a secretary to Trotsky, and then the Forrest Johnson tendency wrote on women's issues, women's struggle, Maoism, and much really interesting to read. C.L.R. James, who was a Caribbean author, wrote a fantastic book on cricket, actually well worth reading, Beyond the Boundary. And the Situationists International and the Lettrists, French experimental meaning kind of language game theorists who also got involved in political stuff. For example, the Situationists, they were behind the student occupation of the Sorbonne in 1968, where potentially, if the Communist Party hadn't lost its nerve, perhaps France would have had a rebellion. They were against the Vietnam War, the students, they were against French colonialism, like Algeria and all of that. And yeah, you can read separate histories of that, but the Situationists were Guy Debord and Society of the Spectacle. The argument that contemporary capital was a series of images, of spectacular images that had no real substance. Celebrity culture, for example. Right up to the autonomous Marxism, operaismo, autonomia, and open Marxism. I mean, that's a little bit dated now. There's a few more things to add. Okay, so like Kolinko, the call center communism thing that we studied and can look at again. Educommission, critical thinking, participatory methods, collaborative methods, civil contract, counter mapping, a number of things that I really need to leave to other courses. Kolinko, the one that we did examine, that was the idea of that is classic autonomia. The idea is a group of activists, anthropologists, if you like, enter a workplace full-time as workers to have a look for themselves, to participate in the life of the locals, in exactly the way that Malinowski would have recommended, but in this case it was a call center, but then to use that as a way to encourage and agitate so that the workers themselves produce knowledge about their condition. So not just consciousness raising, but also the production of knowledge. And their questions that they raise are determined by the people who work there. And the idea is that since labour produces value and power, therefore, the workers who are in a place should take a controlling share of what the organisation knows about itself, right? So the production of knowledge should be done by the people of the community that the knowledge is about. And a new way for anthropology to work here would be to see the anthropologist as a facilitator of that self-conscious reflection. This is a change in the way in which field research would be done. It changes the role of the anthropologist from the one who writes books about other people to the one that helps other people write books about themselves. And, you know, it's not going to be recognized by established departments of anthropology anytime soon, but a slow movement might be possible. There are, of course, critiques of Kolinko for being, you know, a bit vanguardist. The inquiry model sets up those who participate in the inquiry as somehow the separate and foremost workers. And in a way, you can, the riffraff critique of them is interesting. It basically said that they were trying to swim without learning how. And their work in call centers was kind of slumming tourism of the workers' condition. And that's true, that should be questioned. And that gets back to the whole thing about anthropologists tending to study the marginalized and the minority. Because you would really want the workers' inquiry to be in the mainstream institutions. You know, like a university or a finance company or something like that. So, you know, yeah, wage earning subjectivity is not really embraced by those who choose to go and slum it for a while in a factory. And especially if then their agenda is knowledge work rather than working for a living. But they learn something through this process, and I think we all can study what they did and think then, how would a workers' inquiry model work in institutions that aren't just call centres? Although I was a bit shocked to see that the call centre photograph that Kolinko has looks a bit like our office here in the university in downstairs in 118, which has got exactly these corrals which separate each worker off into a small unit. And it's significant that we don't really step back out of those units to talk about conditions of work as much as we might, given the hours that people are required to work here. Getting a research group together for our faculty is very difficult because people don't have the time to research. Now, I think you've got the same problem in some sense. You have too much time in class, too much teaching, not enough time just in the library to read. That's also the case for our faculty. They spend too many hours teaching, don't have time to read and research, which takes time. It's a slow process. You have to talk to a lot of people. You have to go and have a look for yourself. You have to read the theoretical work. You have to develop questions and analyze issues. And you can't do that on the fly. You can't do it on the run. You can't do it quickly. It takes time to understand something. It's not have a look and report. It's have a look and think what you're going to do with what you see. And, well, you know, yeah, that's our main issue now in the current conjuncture. It's not that we're stuck with ideas of where to go. It's we're stuck for time to implement them. I think that's the main issue. So I suppose the first step is to buy some people some time for research. I don't know, I'm now speculating wildly about what we should do in the future. And in a sense, you can't really do that as a, no, we're not fortune tellers, what will happen. But I think if we don't find time, nothing will happen. So. Okay, I see it's 1:30. I want to leave enough time for us to spend working on essays. What I would like someone to do, I'm going to stop now, we'll have a 10-minute break, but during that break, I would like a volunteer who wants their essay deconstructed and reassembled with the collective help of the class to write up their main ideas on the board. I'll stop this recording for now, and we'll get a volunteer. So thank you for that. Stop.